Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have it ready hot, fresh, and fast. Whether it's lunch on the go, dinner with friends, or a full-on fiesta at home, Cafe Rio always brings the flavor and the fun. So what are you waiting for? We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com.
You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you on another day. We're getting mid-November. You know, we're true holiday season. You know, we're rocking, right? Like, we're ready to go. There's two games left of the regular season for football, which is kind of sad. It goes fast, but at the same time, it also kind of it's a long season, right? Like, I think there's a lot there. So, yeah. So happy to be back with you. It's been a rough little bit for me the last week and a half, and so I apologize for not getting any podcasts out last week. I had plans to do it. Partly my schedule wasn't working, and also my company went through a reorganization. So just let me tell you about that in just a second, but let me tell you about our partners, Cafe Rio. Craving fresh, made-from-scratch Mexican food that actually tastes homemade? Cafe Rio's got you covered. Every tortilla is hand-rolled, every sauce is slow-simmered, and every bite is bursting with bold flavor. Hungry yet? Don't wait. Order now at CafeRio.com. Build your burrito, salad, or tacos exactly how you like them, and we'll have them ready, hot, fresh, and fast. We've got you covered. Savor the flavor and order now at CafeRio.com. All right, so kind of getting to a little bit of those changes, and the reason I bring this up is because it does have some impact. I would assume it's going to have some impact. So essentially, what happened is our two sister companies that occupy KSL branding, so we're KSL.com, and then there's the broadcast side, which is Bonneville, TV, you know, that kind of stuff. We basically merged back together. So what happened years ago, back in about 2009, 2010, our company from the upper level, the one that's DMC, they decided to split the digital product from the broadcast product. So TV and radio essentially went together, and then the website, KSL.com, separated into its own company. And there's other things that went on around that time that did that, and part of it was the company wanted to grow the digital side of it and not have to be kind of beholden to the broadcast side. And so it was just meant to try to grow both, who had different entities. And we all still rolled up into KSL.com, and everything was published there and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, years later, TV kind of spun off a sports product called KSL Sports. That's the product where Steve Bartle works for. There's a bunch of other people there that work there, but for Utah fans, that's the product that Steve Bartle works for. And then I always was on KSL.com. And so we were sister companies essentially, and we all occupied the KSL name, but for all intents and purposes, we were not part of the same team. And so that's why you never saw me and Bartle necessarily collaborating. We obviously had a good friendship and still do have a good friendship, but we basically were different entities. And so, you know, it was a really uncomfortable situation, and it wasn't easy to work with because we'd have to try to explain, no, well, I'm KSL, but he's KSL, but we're not at the same time. And so it just became a challenge. And so, you know, a few years ago, our company from the DMC level figured that they needed to do something and try to merge us back together, that it was kind of finally time to get back there. And so last Wednesday, the president of DMC announced that they were merging us all back together. We're all under the same roof now. But as such, you know, there was, you know, a handful of employees that had to be let go because you just can't have that much staff, you know, when you had two companies now coming into one. Or at least that's, you know, the belief that there was. And so, you know, I lost a handful of my employees, which was, you know, really tough for me personally. These are people that I consider friends, people that have been working here for a long time that are really talented and, just kind of got caught up in it. And so, everybody's kind of going through with that. But as such, that means that we're all under the KSL umbrella now, which means that Steve Bartle and I are actually coworkers now, and we're not frenemies, I guess you could say. So it's, on one hand, it's a good thing, because we all are under the same brand now. We can all kind of be pulling in the same direction now instead of kind of splitting the brand and fighting against each other. And so it's a good opportunity for us to be able to come together, but there is some casualties as a result of that, and that's what sucks. So as part of that, my role, I don't have any plans to be out of sports, but my role may shift a little bit. I'm not entirely sure. Steve Bartle is a phenomenal beat reporter, and I would love to have him still stay there. And so for me, it's trying to figure out like what my role is going to be within this new realm. So we'll see. I'll keep everybody posted on there. I don't plan on leaving the beat. But maybe, something changes to my specific role and how I report or do different things that way. So, just wanted to kind of give you that update. It's a little bit inside baseball stuff, but at the same time, I think it has an impact on kind of how things go and all that. And it also explains why last week was a bit tough for me. I got caught up in a lot of meetings, obviously had pretty emotional days too, when I had to say goodbye to a bunch of friends and people that I respected and valued a ton. So it's still a work in progress. I'd like to say that I'm over it, but I'm not. But that's the nature of this business, and it's tough. And you do what you can to survive, and that's what we're all trying to do. So that's that. So I did travel out to Waco this last weekend, obviously, to catch the Utah Baylor game, and that's where we're going to spend the bulk of our time on. So we'll get into that. We'll talk about a little bit of a recap and kind of the storylines that come from that. And just a few other things. So the first thing kind of to touch on newsy wise is the game broadcast was announced for Utah's final game of the season. If you remember, Utah has the Black Friday game, the day after Thanksgiving, and that game was always scheduled for 10 a.m. Some people, didn't see that initially, but it is a 10 a.m. Mountain Time kick, so they're in Kansas, so it'll be 11 o'clock their time. But the biggest news there is this game had kind of an either-or designation assigned to it, meaning Utah was either going to play on ESPN or ABC, and ESPN picked up this game instead of ABC, mostly because I would assume Kansas just really hasn't been doing anything. There's other factors that I'm sure go into that because you're trying to get the conference races and different things that way. But for the most part, this was a game that had potential, especially with Kansas looking to be one of the top teams in the conference. And unfortunately for them, they just haven't really factored into the conference this year in terms of the competition and everything. So still a tough game. That's still, a trap. I wouldn't call it necessarily a trap game, but it's just a tough game body clock wise where, you're traveling to another time zone. It's an early kick. It's a day after a holiday. There's a lot of things that can go wrong there, but for the most part, nothing really changes there other than which broadcast channel you're going to watch it on. I don't know if that matters to some people, but that's kind of what it is. So interesting nonetheless. So you've got that. You've got Utah obviously playing this week at 2. This will be the senior day with Kansas State coming to town and last home game at Rice-Eccles Stadium before, the final road game and then potentially whatever postseason situations take place. And we'll get into maybe some of those in a second, maybe not in a second, in a few minutes. But, that's kind of where it's at. And last 2 games for you to see your team completely together and before there's changes. So, that's kind of the nature of that. Also, in a couple weeks, though, is signing day. And so there's not a ton of movement there per se. Utah did, however, lose a commitment today in Hudson Lewis. He's a wide receiver who flipped his commitment to Oregon. This one had been trending that way for a bit, so it's not necessarily a surprise. But obviously, anytime you lose players, that's not an easy thing. But I think in this day and age, I think it's more, I don't want to say it's less about high school recruiting because I think you definitely need that. And you're seeing this year's roster, Utah's having a bunch of freshmen players that are contributing. So it's not like you can totally abandon that and say you're never going to focus on the freshmen because you have to. It's just more of kind of like, how do you kind of manage that as it relates to the transfer portal and everything that you need. So I don't, they all matter. Like, I'm not going to put a shiny face on it, but I think they all matter, and you lose a commitment, it's tough. But at the same time, you do want players that are going to commit to the program and are bought in. And I know that's a looser term for people nowadays. Commitments don't mean as much for people. I always tell people that some people are surprised by the whole transfer portal movement and kids moving and going different directions. The reality is most of these kids are being fed into competitive sports. So whether that, competitive meaning travel sports, they're not just necessarily doing rec leagues. They're going to different teams all the time. I coached all my kids in baseball, and the movement between a lot of these kids is pretty rapid. And so I think it's just pretty commonplace for a lot of these kids as they're trying to find a team that they fit with, a team that they like. Maybe there's different incentives or perks or something. Look, it's not NIL, but there's different things. So like, it's not really that much of a shock that players want to do that. And I understand the loyalty factor is tough. And it makes it really tough for you as a fan to want to invest in players, especially, when you don't know if they're going to stick around. But I think it's all about building a good culture and a strength there. I will caution that this year is different than last year, right? Last year needed to be blown up. After that season, a lot of things needed to change. And so, whether there was some situations where players wanted to stay and then ended up leaving, or players, wanted to move on, whatever the case may be, I think last year was in a completely different scenario in terms of kind of how players and others were looking at the program. And so this year, based on how this season has gone, obviously there's two games left in the season. Utah's still looking pretty close to, a 9 or 10 win season. That's going to be a much better situation for Utah. It doesn't mean that it's going to instantly change everything, and there's other changes that could take place that could impact that. But at the same time, it is what it is. You get the players that you have, and sometimes it feels more transactional. But I think Utah is in a much better place than they were last year. And I know sometimes that doesn't feel that way when you lose recruits or whatever that may be. But for the most part, Utah's still on an upward trajectory, I would say. I'd still say that they're doing well. They don't have the same resources that some of these programs do, and yet they're still able to punch above their weight. And so, you got to take pride in that and understand that Utah is definitely not dead. It was a down season, and it was a tough season, and it had lasting impacts for a lot of different things. But at the same time, it's not a bad situation. And so as part of that, one of the biggest news elements of coming into signing day is Kelvin Obot, the star offensive tackle that's coming in to potentially replace Spencer Fano. He just got a bump on Rivals and on 3, and is now rated as the number 3 player in the nation. And so that's a pretty impressive feat. Obviously, that means it's a 5-star on those recruiting services. The only other one that does not have him there is 247 Sports, so 24/7 Sports. They typically do their ratings bumps a little bit later. So there's potential that he could be a consensus 5-star. I would assume that, honestly, he gets there. Everything is kind of trending that way. Conversations that I've had with individuals, it feels like it's trending that way. You just haven't seen the 247 Sports bump because they just haven't done that one yet. So, really fascinated to kind of see what happens there. But regardless, you're getting a 5-star from, these other recruiting services. That means a lot for the program because this is the first time that Utah would have a 5-star athlete that's committed to the program. Obviously, it's based on other different recruiting services, but if you get that consensus, that means even more, and that's a big deal. So, with Spencer Fano still pretty heavily locked in as probably a first-round pick, the odds of him staying are very, very, very low. They're not. He's not staying. You're going to have Kelvin Obot that is going to be looked at as a guy that's going to come in and kind of take over for him and potentially be in that spot. Now, just because he's rated a 5-star offensive tackle doesn't mean that he can do it, right? He's obviously been trained by talented guys, and Jordan Gross is his head coach up in Idaho. But he's also, going to a offensive line position coach who's proven it, right? And I think Jim Harding has done a really good job of proving his value and what he's able to do with the offensive lines. And so this is a good opportunity for Utah. And as we've seen this year, offensive linemen aren't the sexy names that everybody's bragging about, right? Everybody wants the star quarterback or the star wide receiver or running back, whatever that may be. And not that those aren't important, but you see exactly this year how valuable a strong and competitive offensive line can be, where Utah can do pretty much whatever it wants in the backfield because of that offensive line. And so I think that's kind of a testament to what Jim Harding's built, but also just a testament to kind of what they can do with the talent they've got. So, good sign for Utah there. And then obviously you have the Pula twins from Lone Peak, who are still in the high school playoffs right now, going into the championship game. Keenan Pulu was the star of the weekend, obviously, with his one-handed interception that he had in the game. And, I think it just kind of shows the versatility that he specifically has. He's still rated a 3-star guy. I would assume that he becomes a 4-star by the time it's all said and done. But shows his versatility as a two-way player. At the very least, he's a great safety and would be a good option there. Kyle Whittingham can't speak specifically on players, but he did mention, he was asked the question about if he saw it. He called it one of the greatest interceptions he's ever seen of his life. And I don't disagree. That honestly was one of the greatest interceptions I've ever seen. ESPN interviewed him. Scott Van Pelt had him as a full segment. I mean, this was just an incredible play. So you've got that. And then his brother, his twin brother, Jaron, is expected to be, he is rated higher, and so he's expected to have, similar potential and do really well on the offensive side of the ball. And so, you have to like what you see with those guys and everything there. And there's obviously a lot of other players that are factoring into this signing day, and we'll get into that more. But there's also flip potential. There's guys that are potentially making the change to Utah, or they haven't announced their commitment publicly to Utah. And so there's going to be a lot of movement over these next 2 weeks. Utah likes to close strong on these types of things and maybe flip a kid that they've had their eye on the entire time. And so we'll see. There's going to be some movement, so don't be surprised if you see some going one way or the other. Don't be surprised if you see another recruit that is committed to Utah decommit, and sometimes that's not by his choice, sometimes it's by the university's choice, but there's different things that way that there's going to be a lot of change there. So spent a little too much time on that one, but I think signing day is in a couple weeks, and it still matters. I don't want to say that it doesn't. You still have to get those high school kids, you still have to build a program, and you have to get to build the depths in the roster and still kind of develop kids. So you got that. So looking at last week's game, so Utah-Baylor, game ended 55-28. Started off essentially slow, you could say. I mean, it's not slow in the sense that Utah wasn't able to score. I mean, it did start slow. They weren't able to move the ball as well. But scored 2 touchdowns in the first quarter. One was a pick 6 by Scooby Davis, and then you had just a passing touchdown to Dallin Bentley, and then it just kind of kept snowballing from there. But Baylor kept sticking around, and it was just kind of this close game till halftime, and things changed in the second half, and Utah obviously stepped on the gas and was able to get it done. So, it was good for the offense. Better for the offense, I would say. I don't want to say that this was one of their best offensive showings, but there was also a lot to brag about with the offense. The offense put up, 380 yards rushing. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal that they were able to get that many yards. You had Byrd Ficklin that came in there. You also had Byrd Ficklin and Devon Dampier on the field at the same time together. Is there something in the packages later on that's going to utilize both of them? Maybe flea flicker or decoy, whatever it is, it's still kind of a decoy. But Byrd Ficklin is taking every opportunity that he gets and milking it, right? And he's dominating. Rushed for 166 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns. His first one goes for 67 yards. His second one goes for 74 yards. Had a nice little stiff arm to get into the end zone, and it worked. He said he was actually most proud of the stiff arm, even though that wasn't something he was necessarily planning to do. He was trying to do something different. It just kind of came out that way. But, this team, going back to that offensive line, has been pretty dominant in terms of what they've been able to do, and that sets it up. Now, if you remember in a podcast that I had a couple weeks ago, I talked about the last 3 opponents that Utah had, and they're just not as great of defenses, especially in run defense. And so, this wasn't necessarily a surprise. But the biggest surprise to me was when Utah came out trying to pass and trying to do something that they usually don't. It was kind of like, it's one of those things where you play that game of they know that we know that I know that you know what I mean? And it's just like, just stick to your game plan and don't get cute and you'll be fine. And once Utah did that, everything changed and everything was better. On the other side of the ball, the defense had its struggles. And the problem with the defense that Utah runs with that man coverage is if one guy gets beat, it goes for big yards. And so, you're putting your DBs on an island and they're expected to do a ton. And this is one of the best receiving corps in the Big 12. And so it's just a challenge, right? Now, there were some successes, right? Obviously, Scooby Davis got his pick six. He read the route incredibly well and was able to pick it off and just take it right to the end zone. Trey Reynolds got another pick later on in the game that was a near pick six, got tackled, I believe, at the 5 or 7 yard line, and, it was close. So, this defense still had its moments. They were still solid. They still forced Sawyer Robertson into not as a successful day as could be, but he still put up 430 passing yards, 3 touchdowns. It wasn't his best showing by any means. He threw 29 of 58, 58 passes. That's wild. I just can't even think of that's just a lot of passes. And yet, he was only 50% on them. So, especially in that first half, he was either on the money and he was dicing up Utah or it was just completely off. And part of that was that defense putting the pressure there, doing what they needed to be able to make him, think and not just get these easy throws. And that's kind of how it went. So, there's definitely good that you can come out of that, but at the same time, this is just not the effort that you wanted to see from your defense, and you're not going to see another team like that in the Big 12. But at the same time, giving up 430 passing yards, you usually lose. There's just not games where you usually allow that many yards and still win by 27 points. So it's pretty impressive that Utah was what they were able to do. I understand you can complain and you can be frustrated by that, but at the same time, you still won by 27 points, which is, in fact, the lowest win margin for Utah in the conference. And so, you're beating out every single opponent by a large margin. It doesn't always look good, but at the same time, you're getting it done. And I think one of my favorite quotes was from Spencer Fano after the game. The team itself was kind of talking about just kind of having each other's backs. And, Devon Dampier said when he wasn't doing as well as he needed to, other people had his backs, whether it be Byrd, Ficklin, or somebody else. And I asked Spencer, I said, for years we hear the defense always saying we've got the offensive's back. And, tonight was the offense's turn. And he said it's about time. And I think they truly believe that, right? The defense has forever been relied on to be able to be this fail-safe for Utah, where, if you can go score 21 points, Utah's going to win because the defense is going to allow 17, right? Whatever that may be. And so I think for the offense to finally have a year like this, it's kind of validating to them to know, hey, we can be the one that's valued too. I was joking in the press box that Utah finally figured out how to be a Big 12 team, and now they're just not worrying about defense, and they're just going for the big passing yards, or not passing yards, but big scores. And so, it's different, right? It's not something that Utah fans are accustomed to seeing Utah's defense struggle as much as they did. But that's the nature of it, right? You're going to get beat at times. And there's, I've seen videos in the past that took place in the game where, there's the back and forth between players, and, you can see why Scooby Davis got a little frustrated because he kept getting face masks pulled on him as he was covering. And so, you can understand that. I don't know what was said or what was officially done when he actually got in a little scuffle at the end of the game. But it's two guys going after each other, right? DB and wide receiver is one of the best fights on a field because those two are always jawing at each other. They're always coming after each other. And when one gets a win, they celebrate it. And I think that's just kind of the nature of these games. And Utah goes very heavy on that man coverage. And there's definitely things that could have been done better. But at the same time, this wasn't one of those things where, Utah's in a world of hurt and they're done, right? Most of these guys have held up very well this year. You're not facing teams like that every single week, but very few teams are like that. And so, Utah did well with what they had. Now, well is a loose term there, considering you allowed 430 yards. So, take that with a grain of salt. But at the same time, Not all is lost. You won by 27 points, and it is what it is. So with that though, you look at somebody like Wayshawn Parker, who is just really kind of coming into his own. He's getting over 100 yards every single game now. He's at he was 129 yards on Saturday, had 1 touchdown on 15 carries. You're starting to see his load kind of increase and able to kind of be what Utah fans want him to be, right? And I know Utah's been trying to utilize him in terms of you mixing it in with N'Kerry Rogers or Daniel Bray, but I think you're starting to kind of see the rushing yards coalesce around him, where he's starting to showcase his talent. Everybody knew that he was talented. That was never the question. It's more just kind of maturing through the process, right, and getting to where he needs to be. And I think you're really starting to see him come into his own. The team itself averaged 8.2 yards per play on Saturday. But Wayshawn Parker was a big factor of that as well. And, right now he's sitting at 736 yards and 6 touchdowns. His goal of breaking 1,000 yards seems pretty well in reach. He still has some work to do to get it in the regular season. But by all means, with the bowl game, or if, miraculously Utah gets to the championship game or playoff or whatever that may be, there's plenty of opportunities for him to be able to showcase his talent still and continue to grow. And the biggest thing, though, is he's a sophomore, right? And the fact that he's coming on strong these last few games kind of shows where he's at. And if you can continue to build on that into next year, that shows a good trajectory for where Utah can be with him, especially if you can maintain a little bit of your integrity on the offensive line. It's not going to be the same as this year. This year is generational in a lot of ways of what they're able to do. But if you can continue to build off of that, you've got somebody that's talented and can be a workhorse for you, and somebody that's going to be one of the biggest assets to the team. So I think that's pretty impressive, and you should be pretty happy about that if you're a Utah fan. But the biggest question, or not question, but the biggest storyline coming from the game is just once again about Devon Dampier injured. And he didn't necessarily get injured in this game. He's been playing with injury this entire year. Obviously, his ankle has been rough. He's got issues, that go beyond that. And so it's been a challenge for Devon Dampier. And he's been trying to make the most of it and trying to play every single week. But Whittingham kind of pulled back the curtains a little bit on Saturday and said that most weeks he's just honestly not getting a ton of reps. And they're trying to utilize a lot of that time to get him healed up. And it's frustrating to him because, to Dampier, because he wants to be healthy. He wants to be out there and do it. And he's the type of competitor that he's going to go out there and try to fight for his team. And I know there's a lot of fans out there that are frustrated by that, and they say Byrd Ficklin has to be a guy then. And I still don't know. And I say that with the caveat that we still don't know what his passing is going to look like. Now, with that said, I've seen him pass, right? Like I've seen it. So it's not like we're without that in his skill set. But the one game where he has had the full reps, meaning like he knew he was going to be the starter, it was a bad day for him. Now, with that said, he's a freshman and he's rushing and it's his first full start. Like that's the first moment that I've seen from him where, he looked a little bit more nervous. I still don't think it was, but I think that's kind of the nature of your first start, right? Like anybody'd be lying if they didn't say that they were nervous their first start. Like that's just what it is. And so it's tough to know exactly what Utah has on their hands with Byrd Ficklin in the full complementary set of being a quarterback, right? He's obviously a phenomenal runner. And yesterday, talking to the media, he said that, he delivers more in game moments, but he doesn't feel like he's the fastest player. And, I think that's true to some extent, but I think he just finds a way that when the lights are shining, he delivers. And I think that's what you need in a quarterback. And so I think that's encouraging, but there's still a lot to be known about Byrd Ficklin. And so, there's a lot of questions about this week, for example. Like, do you sit Devon Dampier and let Byrd Ficklin get all the reps? There's value in that, right? But I don't think that there's I don't think 1 week rest is going to change anything for Dampier, right? Like Kyle Whittingham said, had we not been on a bye week, he wouldn't have played that week. And so you're seeing the situation where, yeah, obviously time is necessary for Dampier to be able to get there. But at the same time, he's still able to get out there and perform. And I understand it's not to the level that he had been at the beginning of the season. But at the same time, he's still the leader of the team, and you want to be able to have him out there. And the benefit that Utah has is they have Ficklin, who really doesn't provide any drop-off, right? And I think that's the biggest thing. If you can have Dampier out there, and it's not, going to impact him to the point where it's going to hurt him long-term, then there's no reason not to play him. If he can play, if the medical staff agrees to play him, I think there's still value there because he is the leader of the team. And not that the team doesn't rally around Byrd, but there's something to be able to having your leader out there, the guy that everybody can rely on, who understands everything and has seen a lot to be able to be out there and get things going. The benefit for Utah is that they have blown out a lot of these teams, and so he has been able to get some rest and put Byrd in times where, the game is a little bit more comfortable. On Saturday was one of the first times where they put him in a little bit more when the game was a little close. It was an 8-point game at one point, and that's when Byrd went for his 74-yard touchdown and kind of changed the trajectory of it. But at the same time, it's a good situation for Utah, and each situation is unique where this one can work the way that Utah is designed now. Now, looking long-term, you've got two starting caliber quarterbacks, and decisions are going to have to be made, right? And each one is going to have a stake at wanting to stay at Utah or going somewhere else. I mean, that's just the nature of what this is, especially for talented quarterbacks. And so it's going to be a challenge for Utah to try to keep both. Now, Dampier, reportedly and I've talked to people who have said that he signed a multi-year contract. And so assuming that everything is the way that it is and, he doesn't, renege on his contract, I think you can say that Dampier is going to factor into the plans next year, and Utah'd be stupid not to, right? Like, admittedly, they'd be stupid not to and give up on Dampier. Like, you still don't know what you have with Byrd. You have to like what it is, but right now it's a little eye candy, right? Like, because it doesn't have to be a full, push to have him as your starter, and so it's real easy to kind of be attracted to that and say, oh, this is the way that Utah needs to go. Now, I'm not saying that Byrd couldn't be a viable or valuable asset, but I think it's still just a little too premature to be able to understand that. But the reality is, too, that Byrd is going to demand, maybe not top dollar, but pretty high dollar range for what he brings, right? And so there's going to be a lot of programs that are going to be absolutely interested in Byrd Ficklin. Many programs that need a star quarterback who can do what he can do and has the, just kind of that it factor. And so it's going to be tough for Utah to hold two quarterbacks there. But I've heard from, multiple people that there is intent to keep both. The question is, does Byrd want to stay? Now, the one thing that can hurt, or I should say help Utah, is that Utah was basically the only team, at least the Power 4 level team, that believed that Byrd Ficklin could be a quarterback. And so there was a lot of other programs that wanted to move him to safety and didn't really believe that he could be that level, right, where he could be a quarterback and dominate. And so, there's still some maturation that has to go through with Byrd in terms of helping develop his arm. But his dad tweeted over the weekend that Byrd's strength was actually his throwing and not necessarily his running, and now you're seeing that. And so, I think there's definitely going to be value there. His agency that represents him is going to absolutely try to get the top dollar for him. I don't get the sense that they're going to try to stick it to Utah. I think Byrd absolutely likes Utah. He likes his chemistry with Dampier. They've built a system which has been smart from Jason Beck to utilize him a lot in the system where both of them can get in there. I don't know if it's a long-term strategy where you can get both of them in there, but at the same time, you can get both in there and still have success, right? There's not a lot of drop-off. You can still kind of appease each other, well knowing that, okay, Dampier's last year is next year, Byrd can take over from then on. So if you can convince them and sell them on that and still, reach whatever dollar figure that can make it competitive, Utah has a good situation in their hands, and they've got two quarterbacks. One is, for the future. that's going to be the best case scenario. That's going to be the biggest storyline that comes from this program moving forward in terms of personnel, is just because that's where it is, right? Like, if you lose Byrd, yeah, it's not the end of the world because you do have Dampier, but at the same time, Dampier has 1 year left, and then you're back to square one trying to find another kid. So, it's tough, but at the same time, that's the nature of the game, and you got to respect the kids. They've got to make their money when they can, and a lot of this is generational. Look, if you're offering me $1 million right now, I'd take that, right? Like, I'm not in that situation. I don't have future earnings to that, and they do, but I think it's tough when that's on the table, and they're going to have to do what's right. And so Utah has to hope that their respect, or maybe not respect, but their evaluation of him going into college, that he could be a quarterback, can weigh a little heavier in there. But we'll see. I mean, where it stands right now, Dampier has rushed for 543 yards and 5 touchdowns. Ficklin has done it at 442 yards and 7 touchdowns, but he's done it in half the attempts. And so, clearly he's got some talent there. Do I think that if he's the starter that he's just going to continually, run free for 67 yards? No. But he definitely has that ability. And so I think there's potential there. It's just going to be the question that many people are going to have to ask, right? And that's the question I'm going to have to ask, is like, where's it going to go? What's going to happen there, and that's going to be the biggest factor. So the one thing that you should be happy with, though, is that you've got Jason Beck. And Jason Beck can find anybody's skill set and turn it into something, right? With that said, Ficklin was signed to Utah before Jason Beck was even, or committed to Utah before Jason Beck was even in the picture. And so, it was still a little bit taking a chance. Byrd Ficklin talked about it on last night, that Kyle Whittingham was the one that personally recruited Byrd and told him that he could come play as a quarterback. And when their questions arose about who was going to be the offensive coordinator, Byrd said, Kyle just said, trust me, I've got one for you and everything's going to work out. And clearly it did, right? And so I think there's value there. Obviously, he's got a good connection with Jason Beck. He's got a good connection with Kyle Whittingham. Can that keep the value there, and what does that mean? Now, the tricky question as part of that, though, is the Kyle Whittingham question. And it feels pretty obvious that this is the last year for Kyle Whittingham. I think everything that I've heard / kind of everything that's kind of taken place, this feels like the end. I will preface that with saying that there was some of that last year as well, and he decided to stay. But I think just the nature of where everything is at, he brought Utah back to a level where he can be proud about it. If you leave on a 10-2 season and are in contention for the playoff, that clearly shows that you're in a good position. Everything has kind of been moving toward that way, where next year will be Morgan Scalley. So, does that factor into Byrd staying or not? Because Kyle was the one that was instrumental in that. I don't know. You would have to think that he has a connection more than Kyle Whittingham, and I believe he does. He and Dampier are actually really good friends and hang out all the time, but that's going to change. So, tough situation there, but at the end of the day, like, it's an era that's going to come to an end. And this very well could be Kyle Whittingham's last time coaching in Rice-Eccles Stadium. And so, it'll be an emotional day for a lot of people, right? Seniors, obviously, and all the fans that just, hate to see football go and no more games up at Rice-Eccles Stadium. But there is potentially that you are losing a generational coach, into retirement. And so, I wrote a story last week. If you didn't get a chance to read it, you can go to the Ute section on KSL.com and go read about it, or go see my tweets. Probably buried in my tweets, to be honest. But talking about how Kyle Whittingham will stay close to football even after retirement with his son, who is coaching with the Kansas City Chiefs. And so I think there's a lot there for him now that has been built up that allows him to kind of step away from the program should that time come. So he does have to give notice to the university this year, pretty early in December. If they make it to the Big 12 championship game, then it's just a week later. But this is one of those things that we're going to know sooner than later. And, Kyle's never going to put the attention on himself unless he decides to make an announcement going into this game, which I would be surprised. It's all going to be about the players, and he'll always make it that way. He'll never be the distraction. This is one of those things where I wouldn't be surprised if the university sends a press release and announces it for him and just he rides out into the sunset type thing. So, but, if this is the last, depending on whatever feelings you have of Kyle Whittingham, this is potentially the last time you'll see him coaching on the sidelines of Rice Eccles Stadium. And so, what does that mean for you personally and kind of what that brings? So, obviously Utah wants a win there, senior day, but if it is Kyle's last day or last home game, that means something more as well. So really fascinated to kind of see how that goes. And, we'll get that. So let me break real quick to tell you about our other partner, Canyon View Credit Union. At Canyon View Credit Union, it's on the house. Close a mortgage and you get a free appraisal up to $600. To learn more details or apply, visit canyonviewcu.com. All right, we're going to close out this episode today. It's a little low-key episode today, but we'll close out today's episode talking about the little path to the championship for Utah and whether that matters. Utah is in the mix, right? I think there's clearly a consensus now throughout the nation even that Texas Tech, BYU, and Utah are the three best teams in the conference. Now, with that said, those aren't the only teams that can get to the Big 12 title game. There's a fourth. There could be more if craziness ensued, but the fourth is really the most viable outside of the three that I mentioned. And so right now it's set where Texas Tech, who has a bye this week, they close the season out with West Virginia on the road, so it's not necessarily a given. West Virginia could throw out something crazy and really, really make that crazy. But Texas Tech is most likely the one in the championship game. You then have BYU, who is sitting with one loss, and if they win out, they're in as well. And so then you have a rematch of the Texas Tech BYU game. Obviously, Utah fans wouldn't want to see that, or maybe you do, depending on certain situations that could arise. But that's the most likely, just based on the odds, just based on kind of how the games are projected. That's the most likely championship matchup. So Texas Tech versus BYU, right? So Utah can still factor into this, and I mentioned also that Arizona State can factor into this. So there's a couple paths here where Utah wins a majority of the tiebreakers if there's multiple teams tied. So if BYU loses this week, so to Cincinnati, they travel to Cincinnati, not a gimme game by any means. Cincinnati's on a 2-game losing streak. Obviously, it's looking to bounce back. Now more than ever would be a great time for them to win for Utah's perspective. That's kind of, that game is still TBD. But if BYU wins that game, they're pretty well locked in. I mean, they still have UCF on the schedule at home, but that feels like that should be a win. So what would happen is Utah, to be able to get to the championship. So let's say BYU loses to Cincinnati. Then you need to have another team tied with Utah and BYU at 7-2 in conference play to be able to win out. That's essentially all it takes. You need BYU, Utah, and another team to be able to get there. Now, with that said, it can't be BYU, Utah, and Arizona State solely. If it's just those three teams locked up at 7-2, then it's toast. BYU loses out, Utah loses out, and Arizona State advances to the championship game to face Texas Tech, the team that they actually beat. So, there is that scenario. Any other scenario where it's, BYU, Utah, Houston, Cincinnati, ASU, whatever it may be, if there's multiple teams there that takes place that way, then Utah wins a majority of those. So you've got that. If BYU loses or beats Cincinnati but loses to UCF, it doesn't matter how many teams is tied with Utah, assuming that ASU wins out, ASU would advance. So really, the interesting thing here is BYU is in an either-or situation. You either win out and make it to the championship game, or lose one and lose out to everybody else, assuming that there is another 7-2 team out there. So there's still a lot in play, right? Houston is a factor into that. Cincinnati obviously is a factor into that. ASU is a factor into that. Those are all the teams that kind of factor into that. And there's other things that could happen. One team could lose, flip something else. But for the most part, if there's multiple 7-2 teams with BYU included in there, it'll either go to Arizona State or Utah, assuming that there's multiple teams tied. If not, if it's just a head-to-head, like BYU and Utah, for example, and everybody else is 6-3 or something else, BYU obviously gets that because they have the head-to-head with Utah. But when it's into multiple teams, there is no head-to-head. It goes to strength of schedules based on the opponents and everything that way, and so it changes. So that's kind of where it's at. Utah obviously has to win out, and they have to be able to get those wins. But then you have to have some luck on your side. And we've seen this before where, in the last game of the season where Utah goes to Colorado in the early game and you started to see these results roll out. Oregon State beats Oregon, Washington State beats Washington, and suddenly Utah's in the Pac-12 championship. Like, it happens, right? So don't count it out by any means, but at the same time, I wouldn't say don't plan on it because the odds are stacked against Utah. But the Cincinnati game is going to be a big factor into how that rolls. So there's that. Now tonight, Tuesday night, if you're listening to this on Tuesday night, the college football playoff rankings will be released again. This is the third iteration of that for the season. BYU and Utah were locked up together. I don't imagine that changes much outside of now Texas will drop below them. So do both of these teams move up? I would assume that BYU still stays above Utah. That'd be pretty crazy if they don't, but, crazier things have happened. If, for whatever reason, they don't, instantly Mark Harlan will be blamed for that because he's now on the selection committee and BYU fans will go after him. So, prepare for fun if that's the case. But I have to assume that both of these teams stay pretty locked into each other. That's good for Utah and bad for Utah in the sense that Utah doesn't have a lot of upward mobility because of BYU. They also don't have a lot of strength because Cincinnati lost, but at the same time, they're now dominating every single opponent that they're playing. They're getting, they're high in success rate. They're high in different things that way that benefits them. But we'll see, right? With that said, if Utah does miss out on a Big 12 championship game, yes, an at-large bid is still in play, but I would say it gets much trickier because I just don't see a world where the Big 12 gets 3. 2 is a push on its own. And if BYU and Texas Tech, are in the championship game, if BYU goes and beats Texas Tech, both of them are in, and that's it. Like, I would be very surprised if Utah factors into there. Granted, that could potentially help them, but it just means that it's going to go into other hands, and the SEC or Big Ten or somebody else is going to factor into that. Now, there's other results that could factor into that as well, and that's what makes this so tricky. But I think Utah's just kind of boxed into a tough position. And, if you make it to the Big 12 title game, you have to win. You can't afford a third loss unless it's a very close game, and clearly Utah had a chance to win it at the end or they lost it at the end. Even then, that's tough to have 3 losses in the Big 12. That's just the nature of what it is. If you have 3 losses in the SEC or the Big 10 in the championship game, after the championship game, yeah, maybe you get a little bit more leeway. The committee did say that they're not necessarily factoring in the conference, but I'll believe it when I see it. So, it's a tough spot for Utah to be in to get into the playoff outside of winning it all. But, there is still a chance. And so, as long as there's still a chance, we'll still talk about it. We'll get a little bit more of an update tonight. I don't know that there's going to be much of an update other than maybe Utah moves up to 12. But for Utah to get in, you essentially have to be 10. And you have to be 10 at the final rankings of the season. And teams above them could drop, but, it's going to be a challenge. So with that, we're going to sign off today. And we'll see how this goes. But I appreciate you listening. Once again, apologize for not having this last week. But I hope to get back to this on a regular cadence again and get back to what we were used to doing. As always, if there's anything you want me to chat about, any stats updates or anything you want me to talk about, please let me know. Obviously, basketball is going on right now. Maybe we'll get into that in a little bit, but it's all football right now. And we'll continue to go with this and keep going. So we'll do a preview episode of Kansas State this week and kind of get into that and the numbers there. And we'll just continue to get this thing moving. So with that, signing out today. Have a great one.